Well, I want to welcome you all to the third in our signature lecture series. As I say repeatedly, we're always trying to focus on the big questions about both our civilization and our country and republic. And today we're going to be able to marry both those interests, given the rather wide and learned interest, wide and learned scholarship of today's speaker, who is Professor E. Christian Kopff of the University of Colorado. I've known Professor Kopff for a great many years, both with respect to academic and non-academic projects. We share a number of things in common, one of which is that Chris was the founder of a Western civilization program, which goes merrily along at the University of Colorado. So he's a real pioneer in taking on the kind of big subjects that we Western civilization folks think should be at the core of the curriculum. Chris has many arrows in his quiver. He has done a sort of expert philologist in both Latin and Greek. He has done a new edition, a new translation, which involves textual correction of Euripides' Bacchae. And he told me that part of that was accepted by, what was the leading academic authority that...
One of my conjectures was accepted by James Diggle, who edited the Oxford Classical Text.
Okay, well, and for an American to kind of receive that sort of recognition by the... It's rare. So, in addition to that, he is one of the foremost proponents of the study of Latin, both in our colleges and particularly in our schools in the United States. He is the author of a book called, with the playful title of The Devil Knows Latin, or is it Speaks Latin? Knows and speaks, I suppose. Quite frequently. I get communications from him all the time, and fortunately I can't understand any of them, but I call upon Chris in those moments to help me from. So what he's going to do today is talk about the classical foundations of the American founding, the message of liberty and virtue that the classics bequeathed to those who created the American Republic. And with that, let me give you Chris.
Thank you, Steve, for that very generous introduction. Can people hear me? Is that okay? Good. It's great to be here. I've enjoyed my time already. We had snow on Tuesday, so I'm responsible for bringing the cold weather down here, I regret to say, but it meant that my jacket, which I thought would only be relevant for Colorado, turned out to be quite relevant today, the earlier part of the day. It's really great to be here, and I thank you for coming. So the title we chose was Inspired by Liberty and Virtue, the Education of the American Founders. The education of the American founders was inspired by liberty and virtue. The phrase itself, inspired by liberty and virtue, was suggested to me by a Texan, Winston Elliott, the president of the Free Enterprise Institute in Houston. The curriculum that educated the Founding Fathers was not primarily training for a profession. It aimed at preparing future citizens for a life of ordered liberty through the practice of virtue. I did consider using another suggestion made to me by Professor Terence Moore, who teaches history at Hillsdale College. He described the core of the old classical curriculum in my presence as Latin and the rod. In fact, I even turned that expression into Latin just in case a classical school wanted to use it for their motto. lingua latina vergacqua. You want to know most classical schools prefer virtue and knowledge for their motto, and their scientia virtusque, or something comparable to that. Actually, both brief descriptions are accurate. One describes the goals of classical education, what you hope your students will be practicing when they graduate. The other describes its methods, somewhat brutally. But the question I'd like to ask is, why did colonial Americans find this education attractive? In the 17th century, the English crossed the Atlantic to colonize North America. Virginia and South Carolina enjoyed warm climates and soils suitable for money crops like tobacco and rice. Settlers in what was later called New England faced cold winters and less fertile soil. After some difficult years, memorably described in William Bradford's classic account of Plymouth Plantation, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had the resources to found a college. What should the colony's future leaders know to profit from the new school? The first entrance requirement to Harvard College, published in 1642, was founded in 1639, was, quotes, "be able to read Tully or such like classical Latin author extempore," end quotes. Tully is Cicero. He's Marcus Tullius Cicero, so he's Tully as Titus Livius as Livy and Gaius Plinius as Pliny. It wasn't just the Puritan founders of Harvard. A Cicero requirement is also found for entrance into William and Mary, founded in 1693, Yale 1701, College of New Jersey 1746, better known as Princeton nowadays, and King's College in New York, founded in 754, and better known as Columbia. A Cicero entrance requirement for college does not fit with the image of America's founders as living a life free from the dead hand of the past. In 1782, French immigrant Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur, in his book Letters from an American Farmer, asked that question, quotes, "What then is the American, that new man?" End quotes. And de Crèvecoeur answered his own question, as we professors have a habit of doing, quotes, "He is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds." In 2002, Dinesh D'Souza echoed these words in his book, What's So Great About America? Dinesh D'Souza wrote, quotes, as the American founders knew, America is a new kind of society that produces a new kind of human being. That human being, confident, self-reliant, tolerant, generous, future-oriented, is a vast improvement over the wretched, servile, fatalistic, and intolerant human being that traditional societies have always produced and that Islamic societies produce now, end quotes. I would say something intolerant, but I'm too servile to do so. It's not only enthusiastic immigrants who talk this way. According to Charles Murray in his 2013 pamphlet entitled American Exceptionalism, in 1789, quotes, 4 million people founded a new nation from scratch, end quotes. John Andrews, the past president of the Colorado Senate, wrote in his regular column for the Denver Post on June the 20th, 2008, quotes, "The old world is just that, old." Coloradans pride themselves on a state capital from the century before last. Our nephew in Bristol, England, showed us a cathedral from the millennium before last. He's a scholar studying what he called the relatively recent Latin writings of St. Hildegard, who wrote 900 years ago, "Europe's air is thick with the weight of the past," end quotes. John Andrews is quite correct. Bristol Cathedral was begun more than 700 years before the Colorado state capitol. On the other hand, the medieval English Christians who built Bristol Cathedral over the centuries consistently did so in the latest style, Romanesque at first, and later, and for the most part, Gothic. The style 19th century Coloradans chose for their state capital was classical, modeled on ancient buildings some 2,000 years old. I see your millennium, John, and raise you a millennium. It was the favorite style of the early American Republic. As Charles and Mary Beard wrote in their college textbook, Rise of American Civilization, still a very readable introduction to America, Charles and Mary Beard wrote, quotes, "It was with a mind fixed upon the imposing design of ancient city planners that Major L'Enfant conceived his elaborate scheme for the city of Washington. When in 1808 the adopted son of Washington built his mansion at Arlington, Virginia, he seemed convinced that the final triumph of art lay in the achievements of Greeks 2,000 years in their graves. It was to the simplicity, solemnity, and power of Rome, despoiler of Greece, that Jefferson turned for the design of his University of Virginia. In the same reverence for classical antiquity, the colonial Georgian style of the 18th century was at the beginning of the American Republic pushed aside by architects who built mansions for ancient planters, offices for the federal government, and the Capitol to house the Congress of the United States." End quotes. The founding generation wanted to live and work in classical buildings because they had been classically educated. Far from leaving behind all their ancient prejudices and manners, as de Crèvecoeur said, the first Americans brought over not only their national heritage of the English language and the common law, but also the cultural baggage of the ancient Mediterranean lock, stock, and barrel, as historian Clinton Rossiter noted in his still quite readable book, Seed Time of the Republic, The Origin of the American Tradition of Political Liberty. This was Clinton Rossiter's description of of the college education of the founding generation. Quotes, "It's easy to smile at the dull, rigid, crabbed methods that prevailed in colonial colleges. But if we judge the vineyards by the fruit they brought forth, we must acknowledge them a fertile ground of learning, science, reason, and liberty. They may not have taught young men enough useful knowledge, but they did teach them, in their own tradition-ridden way, to think, communicate, and lead. The roll call of Harvard and William and Mary men in the Revolution should be evidence enough that Latin, logic, and metaphysics were a rich fertilizer in the cultivation of reason, virtue, honor, and love of liberty." End quotes. Clinton Rossiter is careful to remind his readers that the methods of colonial schools were dull, rigid, crabbed, and worst of all, tradition-ridden. He cannot bring himself, however, to ignore the Savior's sage dictum, "By their fruits ye shall know them," Matthew 7:20. The classical curriculum and its canon taught its students to think, communicate, and lead. It cultivated reason, virtue, honor, and love of liberty. These were the goals of classical Christian education for the American settlers and colonists, and they achieved them. Just think of Jonathan Edwards, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, graduates of Yale, Harvard, William and Mary, College of New Jersey, later Princeton, King's College in New York, later Columbia. As George Gershwin was to query, who could ask for anything more? This time-tested classical Christian curriculum preserved methods, content, and goals from classical antiquity. Yet the period from the Renaissance to the American founding was one of the most creative in history. Why were they satisfied to ground their children's education in teaching grammar by learning dead languages, to read authors thousands of years in their grave, like Cicero and Virgil? In the 16th and 17th century, great fiction like Thomas More's Utopia, significant theology like Calvin's Institutes and Luther's Bondage of the Will, a Federalist classic like Outhouse's Politica, scientific masterpieces like Newton's Principia. Even Locke's Letter on Toleration had all been composed in Latin. Why not read more recent works like these? Colonial educators tried to immerse their students in the past. Today we think that the future will belong to those who innovate, and so our education must be innovative and liberate the students from the dead hand of the past. Since Edward Thorndike and Robert S. Woodworth in the 1920s, educational research has opposed the classical curriculum. An interesting exception in the research is the research of psychologist K. Anders Ericsson of Florida State on what he calls experts, acknowledged masters in many different occupations. Ericsson is the expert on experts. He studies successful practitioners of a wide range of skills and professions, from police to chess players. Chess is a challenging intellectual activity. Winning involves making moves that your opponent does not anticipate. The communis opinio is that grandmasters win by thinking ahead more moves than their opponents. Ericsson's research, however, shows little correlation with innovation, but significant correlation with hours spent playing over and over the games of earlier grandmasters. Let me quote here from Joshua Foer's bestseller of a few years ago, Moonwalking with Einstein, which is about memory. He's describing the research of Anders Ericsson. Quotes, using magnetoencephalography, a technique that measures the weak magnetic fields given off by a thinking brain, researchers have found that higher-rated chess players are more likely to engage the frontal and parietal cortices of the brain when they look at the board, which suggests that they are recalling information from long-term memory. Lower-ranked players are more likely to engage the medial and temporal lobes, which suggests that they are encoding new information, end quotes. In summary, amateur chess players innovate. Great chess players remember. Outstanding achievement involves knowing the past. By immersion in the past, the classical canon aimed at creating grand masters of citizenship. If the goal of education is to teach students to think, communicate, and lead, then we must acknowledge that a figure like Cicero is the grand master of citizenship, nonpareil. Cicero is the acknowledged master not only of citizenship, but of a clear and forceful Latin in several different tones and styles. I suggest, however, that Cicero mattered to our founders for what he was as much as what he wrote. He was a popular politician. He rose to the highest elective office in Republican Rome, the consulship. He was a successful defense attorney who also prosecuted a few significant cases. His dialogues on rhetoric, politics, and ethics transmitted knowledge of these important subjects to posterity, and he wrote letters that are models of the genre. Cicero's range of accomplishments inspired the ideal of the Renaissance man, the well-rounded man for all seasons, homo omnium horarum, as Erasmus wrote of his friend Sir Thomas More. Our age tends to admire the expert, the specialist. The people who stand at the head of our educational establishment, especially at the great colleges and universities, are increasingly impatient with the ideal exemplified by Cicero, the broadly educated person. This was, however, the ideal aimed at and often achieved by the old liberal arts education practiced, for instance, in Renaissance Italy, Reformation Germany, and England, and colonial America. The 7 liberal arts that formed the infrastructure of the classical curriculum were divided into the arts of language, the trivium, and the arts of mathematics, the quadrivium. The trivium taught language by immersion in grammar, specifically Latin grammar, before students went on to study dialectic, or logic, and rhetoric, the art of speaking and writing persuasively. Debate and persuasion were central to the practice of consensual government, whether we call it Democratic or Republican. The quadrivium taught arithmetic and geometry, with astronomy and music as mathematical subjects. The balance between language and mathematics was as important as the command of the basic subjects. The liberal arts curriculum provided the foundations for artists, scientists, and great thinkers. American education swings wildly back and forth between crises in reading and writing and crises in STEM subjects. STEM is an acronym for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. These crises appeared in the 20th century with the slow but steady marginalization of classical education and achieved critical mass after World War II. In 1955, Rudolf Flesch's book, Why Johnny Can't Read, voiced a concern with language arts that has not gone away. It was sidetracked, however, by the hue and cry that went up after the Soviet Union launched the first satellite, Sputnik, on October the 4th, 1957. Elmer Hutchinson, the director of the American Institute of Physics, told the New York Times on October the 8th, 1957, that unless the U.S. revamped its educational system to emphasize science, quotes, "Our way of life is, I am certain, doomed to rapid extinction," end quotes. Naturally, threatened with rapid extinction, the national government poured money into science programs at the expense of humanities and foreign languages. Not surprisingly, in this environment, enrollment in high school Latin went from 728,600 in 1962 to barely 150,000 in the late 1970s. This significant change in the nation's educational priorities was accomplished with remarkably little public debate. Earlier generations had rejected calls to repudiate traditional classical education, and Americans had enjoyed 200 years of prosperity, creativity, and freedom. The success of the American space program in the 1960s could not have been due to the funds directed at STEM subjects in schools. The scientists and military leaders associated with the space program were all educated in the previous generation, a number of them in Europe. The cycle of crises has continued into the 21st century. A few years ago, educators warned of a crisis in writing. As a result, writing programs and even departments were founded in universities that had long refused academic credit for such a basic skill. This crisis has now taken second place to concerns with what they call the drying up of the STEM pipeline, which can be solved only by additional federal funding. Meanwhile, educators have discovered another crisis, it's always a crisis, in critical thinking. Kids go to school, and after 4 years, they're no better at critical thinking than when they entered. Teachers in writing programs are asked to address it, but as they often admit privately, they spend so much time correcting the grammar of the papers they're grading, they have little time for in-depth instruction in critical thinking and persuasive discourse, or logic and rhetoric. In Real Education, in 2008, Charles Murray explained convincingly that, in his words, quotes, "The tools of verbal expression are indispensable to precise thinking at an advanced level in any subject," end quotes. Writing and speaking ungrammatically is an insuperable obstacle to thinking clearly and logically. Martin Luther once told his friends at dinner, "The world's like a drunken peasant trying to ride a horse. If you lift him up on the saddle on one side, he falls off the other." End quotes. Luther could have been describing the educational establishment in the United States. Instead of careening from one crisis to another, our nation needs a curriculum that is balanced between language and math. It should not be a recent fad, but have been practiced for a long time, preferably centuries. Its success should be demonstrated by wide acceptance in many countries. Its best graduates should be distinguished in a wide variety of areas like literature, art, philosophy, political thought, politics, and science. People like Shakespeare and Michelangelo, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, Jefferson and Adams, Adam Smith and Karl Marx, Galileo and Newton, Linnaeus and Darwin. The Founding Fathers were clear in their own minds about the importance of the classical curriculum. When his friend Dr. Benjamin Rush suggested cutting down or eliminating the classical element from education and concentrating on the Bible and practical subjects like engineering and medicine, John Adams wrote his friend, quotes, "I should as soon think of closing all my window shutters to enable me to see as of banishing the classics to improve Republican ideas," end quotes. Adams valued the classics' Republican ideas. Thomas Jefferson was equally emphatic in his support for education. He expressed this view in a letter to Colonel Charles Yancey in January the 6th, 1816. Yancey was his congressman. He wrote him, it's a famous quotation, quotes, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be," end quotes. Educators like to cite this passage to encourage increased spending to support public education, but Jefferson described the education he favored in his only book, Notes on the State of Virginia, published first in 1781 and then second edition in 1785. Students should begin with reading, writing, and reckoning. In addition, Jefferson wrote, quotes, "Their memories should be stored with the most useful facts from Grecian, Roman, European, and American history," end quotes. From 8 to 16, schools should focus on, quotes, "teaching Greek, Latin, geography, and the higher branches of mathematical arithmetic," end quotes. Jefferson believed in teaching the ancient languages. Quotes, "The learning of Greek and Latin, I am told, is going into disuse in Europe. I know not what their manners and occupations may call for, but it would be very ill-judged in us to follow their example in this instance. That time is not lost, which is employed in providing tools for future operations. More especially as in this case, the books put into the hands of the youth for this purpose may be such as will at the same time impress their minds with useful facts and good principles," end quotes. Jefferson values the classics as a source of good principles. We've discussed several of the ways that the curriculum that educated the founding generation differed from the ideals that reign in the education schools of the past century. Immersion in past history and texts versus freedom from tradition and the dead hand of the past. The educational ideal of a balanced liberal arts education in both the arts of language and the arts of mathematics versus a child-centered education that aims at producing and obeying experts. It's striking that Adams and Jefferson mentioned Republican ideas and useful facts and good principles. The classical education they both enjoyed had a definite curriculum based on the 7 liberal arts and what we would today call a great books reading list that privileged the Bible, Cicero, and Virgil. Ability to read Virgil is found along with Cicero in colonial college entrance requirements. Despite all the facts and knowledge required to master the classical curriculum, Adams and Jefferson, prime examples of its positive results, make a point of emphasizing the importance of ideas and principles. Jefferson's good principles actually seem to be the same as Adams' Republican ideas, an interpretation confirmed by Colonel George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, published in 1776. There, Colonel Mason noted, quotes, "No free government or the blessings of liberty can be preserved to any people but by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue, and by frequent recurrence to fundamental principles," end quotes. The virtue Colonel Mason praised is the virtue necessary for free government and the blessings of liberty, the virtue of a citizen, not the personal virtue that abstains from sexual or financial misbehavior, scorned by John Milton in a passage in his Areopagitica, where Milton wrote, quotes, "I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue, unexercised and unbreathed, that never sallies out and sees her adversary, but slinks out of the race when the important garlands to be run for, not without dust and heat," end quotes. In Politics, Book 5, Section 9, Aristotle discussed ways to preserve a country's political form. He wrote, quotes, "The most important of the factors we have talked about for preserving the nation's way of life, which everyone neglects nowadays, is education in that way of life," end quotes. education. Democracies often fail to educate the young properly, Aristotle felt. He wrote, quotes, "The reason for this is they define freedom badly. There are two marks that are thought to define democracy: sovereignty of the majority and freedom. They think equality is just, and whatever the majority decides is equal is valid. Freedom is defined as doing whatever one wants to do, so that in such democracies people live as they want to, and for whatever they list," as Euripides says. "This is pitiful. Living according to your country's way of life should not be considered slavery, but as self-preservation," end quotes. Classical education aims to produce free citizens of a consensual regime founded on the wisdom of the classical art, liberal arts, and the classical languages. Contemporary educators often advocate liberating students from their country's traditional way of life. For John Dewey, in his book, Democracy and Education, he wrote, quotes, "True individualism is a product of the relaxation of the grip of the authority of custom and tradition as standards of belief," end quotes. In her award-winning book, Cultivating Humanity, a classical defense of reform in liberal education, published by Harvard in 1997, Martha Nussbaum redefined citizenship as the goal of education. Professor Nussbaum writes, quote, "When we ask about the relationship of a liberal education to citizenship, we are asking a question with a long history in the Western philosophical tradition. We are drawing on Socrates' concept of the examined life, Aristotle's notion of reflective citizenship, and above all, on Greek and Roman Stoic notions of an education that is liberal in that it liberates the mind from the bondage of habit and custom, producing people who can function with sensitivity and alertness as citizens of the whole world," end quotes. Nussbaum privileges critical thinking at the expense of history and memorizing great literature, courses that give students something to think about. She objects vigorously to the classical curriculum that studies dead languages, history, and math. She writes, quotes, "It would be catastrophic to become a nation of technically competent people who have lost the ability to think critically, to examine themselves, and to respect the humanity and diversity of others. It's therefore very urgent right now to support curricular efforts aimed at producing citizens who can take charge of their own reasoning, who can see the differences and the different and the foreign, not as a threat to be resisted, but as an invitation to explore and understand, expanding their minds and their capacity for citizenship," end quotes. One possible goal of critical thinking might be distinguishing between different and foreign peoples and customs that are threats to be resisted and those that are not. Tradition has the authority John Dewey deprecates in ethics, politics, and education because it possesses wisdom gained by thousands of years of human experience and experiment, a point made by thinkers in the 20th century as different as philologist C.S. Lewis, philosopher Josef Pieper, economist Friedrich von Hayek, and biologist Konrad Lorenz. This controversy is ancient. Nussbaum begins her book, in fact, by summarizing a debate held to attract a student to Socrates' school in Aristophanes' comedy, The Clouds. She explains, "The spokesman for the old education is a tough old soldier. He favors a highly patriotic regimen with lots of memorization and not much room for questioning. His opponent promises the youth that he will learn to think critically about the social origins of apparently timeless moral norms, the distinction between convention and nature. He'll learn to construct arguments on his own, heedless of authority. The son soon goes home and produces a relativist argument that he should be allowed to beat his father," end quotes. The son, Pheidippides, makes logical arguments to free people from the bonds of habit and custom. He even appeals to justice as fairness, the foundation of Harvard philosophy professor John Rawls' influential theory of defense of liberalism, a theory of justice. Pheidippides argues that since his father, Strepsiades, spanked him when he was a child, it's only fair for the son to spank his father now that the father has reached second childhood of old age. Completely logical statement. Strepsiades has to admit his son has a point. He's being logical. When Pheidippides promises to use the same line of reasoning to defend beating his mother, Strepsiades has his Popeye the Sailor moment. That's all I can stand. I can't stand no more. The ethical norms tested and approved for generations are wiser than ideas that have not stood the test of time, but have passed through only one round of critical thinking. Most people, however, aren't interested in a debate at this level. They want an education that aims at freedom for something. Today, the goal of education is often a job. Because college graduates often earn more than those who stop at high school or even sooner, many parents seem to think that the adjective in higher education refers to a higher salary. Students enroll in STEM classes because they expect them to lead to what we call good-paying jobs. They may, but the expectations may be exaggerated as well. A professor at one prestigious biology department told a group of faculty, "Our majors think they're all going to med school," but only about 20% of them end up getting accepted. Although some STEM majors have better percentages, for example, computer science, according to the U.S. Census Bureau in a report published on July the 10th, 2014, quotes, 74% of those who have a bachelor's degree in science, technology, engineering, and math, subjects commonly referred to as STEM, are not employed in STEM occupations, end quotes. In addition, STEM grads often learn that although their first job pays better than those of liberal arts students, they eventually hit a glass ceiling. During the Republican primary debates, Senator Rubio of Florida gave his opinion that Americans needed more welders and less philosophers. If he'd had a classical education, he would have said fewer philosophers, but still, we understand his point, right? On the stage, because welders earn more. On the same platform with him was a graduate of Stanford who majored in history with a minor in philosophy. Her first job was indeed as a secretary. Her last job was CEO of Hewlett-Packard. Now, Carly Fiorina's is an extreme case, but it's not unique either. University of Colorado President Bruce Benson wrote the faculty in 2016. He likes to do this, so we'll grind our teeth and our dentists will have something to do. Bruce Benson wrote the faculty, quotes, that his administration had surveyed, quotes, the degrees earned by the CEOs of Colorado's top 25 companies. We found that most of them had an undergraduate degree in the liberal arts and then an advanced degree in specialized subjects like law or business, end quotes. Even if it were to be true, which is not proven, and in my opinion, not likely, that all good jobs in the future will be STEM areas, we still need to produce teachers, researchers to write grant proposals, writers to explain scientific discoveries to non-specialists. We'll still need articulate citizens to think about the political challenges and ethical dimensions of scientific discovery, argue for their views, and convince other citizens. Educating citizens without mastery of the arts of language is a recipe for personal frustration and national disaster. Free citizens are not free to do whatever they want. Citizens pay taxes, they volunteer for community service and work in their congregations. They participate in politics and even listen to people they disagree with. At least some parts of America we still do. As Aristotle saw, freedom is not doing whatever you want. It's doing what is best for your country and your family and your community. Aristotle felt Democrats often define freedom badly. To define freedom rightly, citizens need the liberal arts of language, speaking grammatically, with appropriate vocabulary, thinking logically, and expressing the resulting thoughts persuasively are essential for citizens because the goal of political activity is persuading people to make the right decision. This is true whether you're addressing a democratic assembly, an oligarchic council, or even a king. The founding generation wanted to educate citizens of a free society that required virtue. The Continental Congress saw this explicitly in Article 3 of the Northwest Ordinance, which they passed in 1787. The ordinance laid out the guidelines by which new states might enter the Union. Education was a key element in this design. The Article 3 of the Northwest Ordinance begins, quotes, "Religion, morality, and knowledge be necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged," end quotes. Among the first acts of the first Congress elected under the U.S. Constitution, 1789, was to repass and reaffirm the Northwest Ordinance. Education is not only about knowledge. In fact, knowledge is mentioned third in the Northwest Ordinance, after religion and morality. Good government and the happiness of mankind need religion, morality, and knowledge. The founders wrote this because in their struggle for consensual government, they were inspired by liberty and virtue. The technical advantages of classical education, so many of the founding fathers enjoyed, are not contemptible. Command of grammar, so many generations have imbibed from Latin. The riches of the vocabulary of law, medicine, science, politics, philosophy, and theology that are based largely on Greek and Latin. The literary and philosophical works that were produced in the context of the Athenian democracy and the Roman Republic, both of which, we should remember, had their moments of empire, and in Rome's case, much more than a moment. The founding fathers knew this well from their education, and the U.S. Constitution was meant to delay the inevitable decline and fall. In the middle of the Depression of the 1930s, American poet Robinson Jeffers drew upon his classical education to compose his frankest and most sincere assertion of his belief in the validity of tradition, the importance of freedom for America, and America's lasting role in the story of Western civilization. Let me read his poem. It's called Shine, Republic. If you know Robinson Jeffers, the title is a homage to an earlier poem of his. The quality of these trees, green, height, of the sky, shining, of the water, clear flow, of the rock, hardness and reticence. Each is noble in its quality. The love of freedom has been the quality of Western man. There is a stubborn torch that flames from Marathon to Concord, its dangerous beauty binding 3 ages into one time. The waves of barbarism and civilization have eclipsed but have never quenched it. For the Greeks, the love of beauty. For Rome, of ruling. For the present age, the passionate love of discovery. But in one noble passion, we are one. And Washington, Luther, Tacitus, Aeschylus, one kind of man. And you, America, that passion made you. You were not born to prosperity. You were born to love freedom. You did not say en masse. You said independence. But we cannot have all the luxuries and freedom also. Freedom is poor and laborious. That torch is not safe, but hungry, and often requires blood for its fuel. You will tame it against it burn too clearly. You will hood it like a kept hawk. You will perch it on the wrist of Caesar. But keep the tradition. Conserve the forms, the observances. Keep the spot sore. Be great. Carve deep your heel marks. The states of the next age will no doubt remember you and edge their love of freedom with contempt for luxury. Thank you for your kind attention. I appreciate it.
Which works from the classics would you recommend then that men and women leading a government should read, and why? Or should read, and why? And I won't be specific to any particular government.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have a very original answer per se. Well, let me look at this somewhat from the perspective of the founders here, which allows me to fudge a little bit, so if I'm wrong, I can blame them. But on the Latin side, they valued history. The historian they valued most was Tacitus, because he described what happened when you lost your freedom. Nowadays, the figure we tend to value is the Greek historian Thucydides, because he talks about what a democracy can do, which is powerful and prosperous and controls an empire, and then how that can lead to disaster when the wrong mistakes are made. On the philosophical side, you can't beat Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics. They're wonderful. And there's also, the founders would insist on Cicero, especially his work on duties, De Officiis, and his Tusculan Disputations, which are how to be a moral person and how you attain that. So those are the works I think leaders need to lead. Of course, there are a lot of great works that you read for other reasons than being a leader. Great question. Thank you very much. Please.
You know, this week, one of the last of the Opis died, the British folklorists, who recorded, among other things, the schoolboy saying that Latin is a subject that nobody enjoys. It killed the ancient Romans, and now it's killing boys. And there is in this classical tradition you describe a sense of hierarchy and canon that requires that the students not necessarily be leading the schools. And is it possible to have a vision of classical education in a world that's increasingly student and child-centered?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the central differences between progressive education, classical education, is that progressive education emphasizes the child-centered idea. This is not especially original. It goes back to Rousseau, who was in the 18th century. And again, so much of what we have in our society goes back to that period. Some of them good things like inoculations, right? And some of the things, and our own constitution. And some things we can debate, like Rousseau's ideas on education, where the child should decide. And it's what we teach in our ed schools. Yeah, one of the things that classical education says is there's a curriculum you should follow, there are great books you should read, and we don't vote on it. One of the things that frustrates classical headmasters I know, and when I talk to them, is they have won over the parents, right? And they've shown them not only that classical education is good, but why it's good. And then they say, well, are we settled? And the parents say, well, yes, but we have to go back and ask our son or our daughter if they want to do it. And you sort of sit there like, well, this explanation was about why, a 10-year-old should not be determining the 10-year-old's education. Why thousands of years of very smart people, like the ones I mentioned, Tacitus and Cicero and Plato and Aristotle, know more than 10-year-olds. In fact, I think they even know more than we know, so to speak. But you're absolutely right that there is a feeling here that we have to get the kid to join in. Now, in fact, bright kids often end up loving it. Tolkien's mother insisted that he go to the classical school that his father went to, King Edward VI school in Manchester. And Tolkien was perfectly happy to go to the much more mediocre Catholic school he was going to. But when he went there, he was challenged and was so excited and became the scholar he did because he was challenged. He wouldn't have made the decision himself, but his mother loved her father who passed away. The father, had gone to the school, and so our kids have to go to the school. And in fact, it was a wonderful classical school. And an important reason is another essay of mine on classical education in Tolkien, which you don't hear too much because he was a great student of Old English, so that's what's usually talked about. So the point I understand you to be making, that we live in a world of child-centered education, is absolutely true, and classical education stands in front of that train shouting halt. And there are more of us every year, that's good. Will we ever get back to the stage when half the kids in America study Latin, which was true in the early decades of the 20th century? I don't know. Good question, good insight though. Please.
Is there any study that's done, and Neil Postman recently said, well, not recently, in his book Technopoly argued, if you want to revamp your culture, redesign your educational system, is there any study that has shown that when we really re-excite our educational systems, when we go back to a classical kind of approach to it, it seems like that seems to be a recurring event in our histories, in European and Western history. Is there anything that sets that as a more sure way of understanding that?
Yes, and you're asking some very interesting things. I'm not 100% I have answers for all of them. There's partly, are there studies that show various things? And certainly people who study challenging languages, whose vocabulary helps you to learn the languages of the vocabularies of law and medicine, etc., do better on tests that test that thing, on SAT, etc. And it's always held against them, right? Well, of course, people who have classical education do better in the SAT because the SAT is more or less set up for that. It emphasizes vocabulary, critical thinking, on and on. It's totally unfair. The other side is, which I also heard you talk about, excitement. And that's the issue which I had a friend at school at Boulder years ago, Gene Glass, and he studied studies. He was a master of statistics. He studied, and he could get together 10 studies, each of which were imperfect in some way, but each of which had something valid and get something out of them. And he shows it. And one of the things he showed was that the most important factor in successful education was enthusiasm, even more than knowledge. What about that? And he said, so this is the bad point of my research, because the one thing we can't teach is enthusiasm, right? We can teach method, we can teach how to use a PowerPoint, we can get everyone with a clicker, we can do all these technical things. We can't teach someone to love a subject so much that it comes spilling out. Now, my experience, which is not a scientific study, is again and again that classical education excites teachers. There was a wonderful program in Philadelphia in the 70s and 80s, which was language arts through Latin. It was a language arts, that is English program, but you use Latin. The guy who invented it, Rudy Masciantonio, did it to find jobs for classics Latin MAs who didn't have a job. But in fact, when the teacher, and they would come to a classroom and they'd just do a little bit of Latin, a little bit of vocabulary, then they'd go. And the hope was that eventually the kids would take Latin. Well, the teachers saw how excited the students were. They wanted to do it. They insisted that Rudy come back and teach them because it was very simple Latin. It was complicated. And Masciantonio often told people, I would advocate classical education as a cure for teacher burnout, even if it didn't help the students in vocabulary or in grammar, which it does, of course. Even if it didn't, an enthusiastic teacher is the most valuable part of an education, in one sense. And when you're really teaching something important, you become enthusiastic. Now again, there's no, Masciantonio's opinion was based on hundreds of classrooms, so he could have written it up. But that's my experience also, that there's the issue of, is there evidence that studying difficult foreign languages and mathematics prepares you for college better than others? Yes, there is evidence like that, though people object to the nature of the evidence. But there's also the question of enthusiasm. Teaching something that matters and has mattered for a long time is exciting. And ironically, that's one of the most important parts of education, is a teacher being excited, exciting the students. And my argument is classical education does that better than any other. No system is perfect, we all know that, but what has worked again? So, I hope I responded to your question in some way. Yes, please.
In line with what the gentleman behind me said, in my high school, which was Catholic and 2 years of Latin was required, the saying was, Latin's a dead language as dead as it can be. It killed off all the Romans, and now it's killing me. Are you familiar with St. John's colleges, which are Annapolis and Santa Fe?
Yes, I am.
Well, they teach a curriculum that they call the Great Books Program, which starts with the classics of Greek and Latin.
Yep.
And it's what you know about it and what you think about that program.
Well,
I tried to get my little son to go there, but he didn't do it.
Yeah, the one in Santa Fe could be viewed as isolated, though Santa Fe is beautiful. Of course, the other is Annapolis is also a great place. It's a great college curriculum. It emphasizes learning by reading the originals. They learn their geometry by studying Euclid, not by a modern textbook. There's a big emphasis on Greek. It's more Greek-oriented than Latin-oriented, which is great, opposed to Greek being a central language. And there are some classical K-12s that do Greek instead of Latin. The Bible being part of the reason. The kids, what you do find there is that there are some bright kids who go there and then get so excited that the limitations of the system frustrate them and they transfer to a larger school that has more subjects. The ones I've known have been absolutely exciting, fun to talk to. Their alumni meetings are fantastic. Kids who go through those 4 years, reading the foundational texts of our culture, reading Euclid, not a watered-down textbook, reading the great philosophical works of Plato and Aristotle, not a modern book on introduction to metaphysics. They come out of there articulate, lively. They continue to be that way. They are utterly unprepared for any profession. Absolutely unprepared for any profession. But what they're prepared to do is anything that involves being interested and excited and persuasive. And of course, they do go to law school, business school, some of them. But I think it's really one of the most successful educational classes we have. The irony of it, of course, is you can't take it and multiply it really. Because, well, let's have a school of 60,000. No, you can't do that. It has to be a small school. And it has to stick to those texts. And by the way, it's very demanding on the faculty after what to do. We all think we're better than the past, right? And here we are spending our lives reading these great masterpieces over and over again. So it takes a certain kind of person. I once had a student who asked me about reading, as I just did before I came here, Socrates' Apology, and someone said, "You must have read this a lot." And I said, "I read it every semester." It's like impossible. I always get the most out of it. I mean, that's the ironic part of the classical education. I mentioned Rudy Mashintonia saying he plug it as a cure for teacher burnout. But it's the most exciting things. And Ezra Pound somewhere says, things that have been found important and exciting for thousands of years by the most brilliant people who ever lived probably aren't very boring. And that's one thing that St. John's is very aware of and very successful at. As I say, you bump into their alumni. They're just so interesting to talk to. Now, you shouldn't have an educational system just to create interesting people to talk to. But there are other advantages. There are other advantages besides that. Great question. Do you want another?
Please, Ray, are you familiar with Dorothy Sayers' essay, The Lost Tools of Learning?
Yeah, the answer is yes.
Okay, there's a whole growing area of interest of private and homeschooling kind of education, classical education, that's kind of based on that, and Doug Wilson's response to that. A lot of it's based on Dorothy Sayers' assumptions about grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric as kind of the lower levels of school. And what you thought about her prescriptive approach to that, and whether you feel like that is truly classical in all of its approaches, or do you think there's something that they have to do to make it a more classical way of understanding?
You're asking a good question. Okay, it's the late 1940s. Dorothy Sayers writes mystery stories, very successful. She starts reading Dante and translates it. And she writes this essay saying, Dante had this education. And it's actually a pretty smart education because at least what it does with language is it seems to model what kids need. First, you memorize easily. Then you learn to be this wiseacre, right? And that's where the logic fits in. And then eventually you can really be creative. And that's what rhetoric really is. It's a creative use of language. Well, the essay floated around for a long time. In 1980, when the SATs had reached their low point, especially verbal, but only even math, a Calvinist pastor in Moscow, Idaho, Doug Wilson, read the essay and said, I'm going to invent a curriculum based on this. Now, what he sort of did was, almost literally, this is though you say, if you put 4 of these round things on a square box, the box goes more easily, right? So there was no question he was reinventing the wheel that had existed throughout the whole history of the West, virtually. One, it is possible to be a Dorothy Sayers fanatic and insist, I think, too rigidly on, for example, the levels, the way that grammar, logic, and rhetoric match childhood development. You can be too rigid about that. On the other hand, some people, like Gina Woodvie, have argued that every subject has a 3-stage grammar level, basic facts, logic level, you learn how to manipulate, and then rhetoric level, you really create. And maybe relatively few of us ever get to the really highest level of all. So that classical education, I think it should involve the balancing of arts of language and arts of math. It doesn't have to be the 7 liberal arts. I think that the 3 uses of language that they specify are key. It doesn't have to be associated necessarily with a particular age of a child. And I'm a big fan of Latin, obviously, and sometimes you hear debate about that. If you fit Greek in, that's great too. I was very lucky from that perspective. So yeah, I think there are a lot of different classical schools play with the model, and I think they're right to do so. If you go up to Moscow, Idaho, they're still Dorothy Sayers fundamentalists, and I once was at a meeting in which they were asked what creative new ideas they had brought to study, and the guy sort of looked at the person asking it like, you don't understand the point of our school. Our point of our school is precisely not to do something new and creative, but by using the past to produce students that are creative. And the guy who asked the question was flabbergasted. Never heard anybody say, no, all right, we give you a traditional, challenging education rooted in the past so that when you face the future, you will have the tools to face that future. Dorothy Sayers is the patron saint of the modern classical education movement, classical Christian education movement, but it's perfectly legitimate to modify her views the way Veith has done and the way others have done. Does that respond to your asking? Great. Yes, please.
Yeah. The current political environment we have in the United States today, I've heard many commentators say that the founders in our work, the way they drafted the Constitution, could not have imagined the political situation we have in the world today, especially in the United States. And I'm always remember the Alfred J. Knox comment that the mind that is schooled in the classics is an experienced mind. What are your thoughts on what the founders think about the character of the political?
Yeah, good. A very good point. By the way, Albert J. Knox, Theory of Education in the United States, a great defense of classical education from 1930, a long time before Doug Wilson and Dorothy Sayers came along. There are 2 points. One is, I don't actually think the founders would have been surprised that we've degenerated to where we've gotten. They would be surprised it took us so long. Adams and Jefferson at the end of their lives had this great correspondence. It's one of the great, frankly, masterpieces of American literature. Get a chance to read it. It's really wonderful. And they are, foreseeing the collapse of everything. And of course, when Andrew Jackson became president, John Quincy Adams went back home and reread the Philippics of Cicero, which is his denunciation of Mark Antony's tyranny after the death of Julius Caesar. So he thought it already happened, frankly. My own opinion is they wouldn't be surprised that we've gotten to this stage. They would be amazed it took so long, and they would think precisely the point you brought out, that a lot of our problems, we don't see things in perspective. And this is Knox's great point, that a person who has looked through almost every area of human accomplishment, not as what's the latest thing, but what is you get the Barnes & Noble catalog, what's the new book? What are the foundational documents that go back thousands of years? has a kind of perspective on the world that then can look at it. I mean, the example I use, which is very political, but still, Alexander the Great invades Afghanistan, and he discovers it's the easiest country in the world to invade, but it's impossible to conquer. So he marries an Afghani princess and declares victory and goes out again. Boy, it would be useful if people knew Alexander the Great, who after all is a very important figure in history and in other areas. Now that's a specific case. The classics don't necessarily give an answer to every specific problem. They give exactly what you said. They give the perspective to look at these things from a long range of thousands of years. And the problem we're facing is that not only do we not have that, but our educators don't think it's a good idea. Every year our chancellor gives us the state of the campus, and our campus is about innovation and new things. Innovation is in our blood, and innovation is in our DNA. I can't figure out if innovation is Ebola or cancer. One or the other of those things, anyhow. And you're going, it's crazy. We spend our time, and we're most successful at teaching the past. That's what we do. And to the extent that we're not, we aren't helping our students at all. And it's precisely, again, to give a specific example, this absurd thing that philosophy majors don't earn money. One, it's not the most important thing. People that can think eventually find their place in life. So it may involve earning a lot of money, and it may involve, in fact, having a more satisfying life. There's all different choices that people make. But that's what classical education comes to give you, is a perspective. So you look at the world around you and you can see that. And the obsession with something new things that matter come out of traditions of creativity. Almost every great scientist, from Copernicus to Heisenberg and Schrödinger and on, had classical education. And then they devoted them to studying science. That's equally true of literature, that's equally true of almost every area you're talking about. So yeah, our real problem, I think we can obviously make this, is lack of perspective. And that is what a classical education would give. Because the guys who run us are smart. They really aren't stupid. But they lack the historical perspective that gives intelligence the wherewithal to deal with it. So it's a great question. Thank you for it. More than that, Steve? What do you think?
The others.
No outraged denunciations? Please!
I'm still trying to get exactly how I want to say this, so I apologize if it's a little crooked, but I was thinking about the role of virtue in education, in classical education, and how it almost seems like we celebrate that we have like a value-free education in public schools today. I'm trying to think of a way to ask about what the importance of the way in which virtue was taught in classical education. What are we losing by not teaching virtue anymore? By not, we're almost allergic to this idea that somebody's going to teach our children values apart from the values they select or I select.
Yes, you bring up a really good point. I think all education includes ethical dimensions, because you can't really teach it without making a statement about it. The problem is we've sort of kidded ourselves, and the best way is to therefore be explicit about it. This is, we're going to read Cicero's On Duties. He's going to talk to you about what it means to follow what is right, and what happens when it seems like it's against your interest, and why ultimately that'll never be true. Now when you're reading that work, he is definitely arguing from a point of view. It's a point of view involves citizenship. He can't stop saying bad things about Julius Caesar, because tyranny is the opposite of citizenship. And our current progressive education does teach ideas and ethical ideas, but unfortunately too often it's refusing to judge, right? My ethical views are like my opinion of steak. Some people like it rare, some people like it well done, some people like honesty and probity, and some people like humor to get away with. I mean, on and on and on. You can't blame people. And ultimately, every educational system must have an ethical foundation. What I think Americans want is one that will continue the society we have, which has consensual institutions and that kind of citizenship. But being a citizen doesn't mean you're free to do whatever you want. It means exactly the opposite. You gotta get up and vote, even during the midterm elections. It means you pay taxes. It means you show up at these stupid meetings with your boring neighbors saying silly things, but you act polite to them and you respond to them. These are all duties. Duties of citizenship are the basis of the rights. And our education is doing a terrible job in teaching that fact. That if you want a society, there are ethical norms. If we want to change our society, then we have to do it consciously and rationally. Not as though in our modern education, it's fudging. It's still teaching ethics, by the way. But it's fudging the real job, which is let's be explicit about it, say what they are, give you the reasons. I hope that responds to your question, because that was a very well expressed question.
Well, thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you, Steve.